I ran across this excellent conference speech by none other than our very own Mark W. Smith. And if you don't know who that is, the TLDR is this. He's the brilliant constitutional law mind behind the Four Boxes Diner. And in my humble opinion, y'all should absolutely be following him and his work. He's one of a few sources we get around here at 504 Tactical to educate ourselves on constitutional law. And I advise you do the same. Anyway, I just wanted to highlight some important, what I think are important keynotes from the speech he just gave at the 2024 Federalist Society Conference. So, question number one. What constitutes a historical law to begin with? And how does one derive from those historical laws a principle that constitutes a historical tradition of firearms regulation and the unqualified command of the Second Amendment?
And again, it's very important to start off with the text of the Second Amendment, not as sort of a administrative ministerial task, but it's because the U.S. Supreme Court has specifically said that the text of the Second Amendment is an unqualified command. Now, this is very important to understand. Why? Because when you read newspaper articles or you read comments that go along the lines of like, I don't understand history. History is too hard for me. I'm not a historian. Guess what? If there is no historical tradition of regulation, if there is no history, there is one bit of history that is undeniably there, and that is the text of the Second Amendment itself that is literally in the Constitution, which is indeed the definitive historical law, the historical analog, if you will, of the views of the founders as to how they viewed the right to keep and the right to bear arms. It's in the text itself. So anyone that says, I don't understand history or we can't find history, the answer is, well, then if you can't find the history, read the text of the Second Amendment, apply and rule against the government.
So what is an unqualified command in reference to our Second Amendment, that is? Well, Justice Thomas stated in Bruen, and I quote, an individual's right to purchase, possess, and carry firearms is to be protected in all but the narrowest of circumstances, end quote. That sounds pretty clear to me. I guess a good example of this would be a stop sign. You know, it's a clear command of what is required for us to do. The text of our Second Amendment is crystal clear, even for those that may lack a few brain cells bouncing around up there. Just saying, it's that clear. So, all right, I'm going to shut up for just a minute. I know, you don't have to applaud so loud, I can hear you. I'm going to shut up for just a minute and let Mr. Smith give you a perfect explanation of how to apply the Heller-Bruen precedent and current good law, I might add.
Go about doing it. And what can they do? What can they not do? To begin with, they are supposed to, of course, as we know from Heller and Bruen, and remember, Bruen is really just Heller with a paint-by-numbers approach. Heller and Bruen are the same methodology. The only difference is that Bruen spelled it out to try to get the lower court judges to follow the Heller methodology of look at the text first, and then shift the burden to the government to find some sort of historical analog exception to the text of the Second Amendment. But the government cannot engage in that approach to finding historical analog laws and deriving a principle if the Supreme Court has already done the historical spade work in a particular case. For example, in Heller, the Supreme Court has already done the text analysis and the historical analog analysis to conclude that in an arms ban case, you cannot ban firearms that are in common use by Americans for lawful purposes. So all these lower courts that decide they want to go off and reinvent the wheel, and they want to invent and come up with new excuses to not justify, let's say, bans on AR-15s, or they want to justify these bans, they pretend that Heller is no longer good law. But my count as of yesterday was the Bruen decision cited favorably the Heller decision over 100 times in the majority opinion. So again, if the Supreme Court has already determined the historical principle, they've already determined the constitutional test, the lower court only needs to apply that test. It doesn't get a second bite of the apple to go out and do more historical work.
That's funny. That's funny, y'all. Bruen is reiterating Heller. For those who either are corrupt or just plain ignorant judges that refuse to use the correct jurisprudence. And we know we do have a lot of that out there. There are a lot of questionable judges. It's up to us to root them out. We need to know who they are. And that's your job and my job. Anyway, I digress. Let me get back to the point. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the lower courts need to find historical regulation to try to justify gun control. How do they do that once the burden shifts? Well, Mr. Smith has the answer. He also has the correct era of time to look for proper law. Take a listen to this.
Gun control law to show it's justified. And if they fail in any one of these three criteria, the government loses, the right to bear arms prevails, and the gun control law goes bye-bye. So how does one start with finding historical analog laws? Well, there's a number of rules that have been set forth by the Supreme Court, which the court has referred to as metrics. The first metric rule is this. To have a historical tradition of firearms regulation, you have to start with actual laws, right? And this is, again, I see this all the time in commentary and among judges. Again, it goes back to, we're not historians. We don't understand history. We don't have a PhD in history. Come on. The right answer is the only history that matters is historical laws. Who actually has experience in looking up historical laws and applying them to modern day controversies? Oh, that would be every lawyer in America, right? By definition, lawyers go look in the past, find laws, and apply to your client's advice today or to a case today, whatever it is. The entire practice of law is looking back in time to what happened at the crosswalk on that day, at that time. What is the law that applies? All this is looking into the past. So the suggestion that lawyers cannot do history is simply absurd and an excuse by certain judges to try not to do the work they're tasked to do with the Supreme Court. So again, the first thing is it has to be a law. It cannot be just some generic history or some proposed law that never became an actual regulation. Number two, it has to be from the right time period. Yes, the Supreme Court has made reference to an academic scholarly fight between whether or not the relevant time period for interpreting the Second Amendment is 1791, when the Second Amendment was ratified, or 1868 when the 14th Amendment was ratified, but it's pretty clear the Supreme Court is going to apply the founding era of 1791. To begin with, Heller specifically says so. This is what Heller writes, quote, "Constitutional rights are enshrined with the scope they were understood to have when the people adopted them." When was the Second Amendment adopted? Not hard, 1791. That is the understanding that controls. And for those of you who question whether or not the Supreme Court will deviate here, I'm just going to direct you to the Supreme Court's decision a few years ago in Espinoza versus Montana, dealing with the religious liberties clauses of the First Amendment, part of the Bill of Rights. And in Espinoza, Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, rejected, listen carefully, rejected 30 statewide laws that restricted certain aid provisions, restricted aid to public schools or religious schools. He rejected those as being too late in time in interpreting the First Amendment. If John Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts, is going to reject 30 state laws from the late 19th century as not a basis to limit the scope of the First Amendment, I can assure you they're not going to use late 19th century post-14th Amendment laws to limit the scope of the Second Amendment.
Yep, y'all heard that right. Regulations must come from founding era. from the founding era. It's clear. And when is that founding era? Well, 1791, to be precise, is when the Second Amendment was adopted. So that's a good start. And in my opinion, I don't know this for fact, but I have always considered the founding era of law to be within like the first 25 or so years. That's just me. I don't know what the correct time frame is, but around 1800 is a good era, I believe. And that's just the way it is. That's where the laws must derive from. If there were no laws restricting firearms back then, there should be no laws restricting them now. I digress, though. Here's what else Mr. Smith said.
Right. Now, the fourth rule as to whether or not an analog can be an analog in a Second Amendment case is the analog well established? Is it a representative example, or is it what I would call an outlier? We know, based on Supreme Court precedent, that laws that are only in existence for a very short period of time or that did not affect a substantial swath of the American population do not establish historical traditions. One need only look at what the Bruen court said, and they say, quote, "We will not stake our interpretation of the Second Amendment upon a law in effect in a single state or a single city." Now, the court did not specify the number of quantity of laws to justify a tradition, but it did say that 3 analog laws are not enough. And it's also worth mentioning, when you're dealing with territorial laws, those are also a no-go zone for deriving an analog, because as the Supreme Court said in Bruen, the territorial laws are not suitable analogs because they were enacted over a century after the Second Amendment. They only applied to maybe 1% of the population, and they were never subject to judicial scrutiny because they did not have the ACLU fighting for cowboy rights in the Western Territories. So one doesn't actually know if they would have been found constitutional if they were ever challenged in court.
Now, let's assume there are still analogs in play by the government. Spoiler, yes. Yes, there are. There are way too many. The majority of the corrupt government and their laws are in fact illegal if you look at the text of the Second Amendment. Not even just the Second Amendment, the text of the first 10 amendments, and you can go ahead and throw the 14th right in there as part of the Bill of Rights, which it's sad that had to be added because every single human, no matter what you look like or where you come from, has the very essential rights. That shouldn't even be a discussion. But here we are.
Analogs by the government that's still in play. You now need to move what I call to the relevantly similar part of the analysis. Relevantly similar gets into, does the why and the how of the analogs you have put together line up with the why and the how modern-day gun control laws exist? Now, what does this mean? I think there's a lot of abstract theoretical discussions we could have, but rather than do that, I want to be very precise and ask what the United States Supreme Court has done dealing with these issues, because I think they really do illustrate how you do the why and the how. In Heller, for example, that was a case involving whether or not the District of Columbia's handgun ban was constitutional. After the court in Heller found textually that the Second Amendment protects all bearable arms, and thus DC's law was presumptively unconstitutional.
Wait, did y'all hear that? Did y'all actually hear that? I know I heard it. He said all bearable arms. All. And this was spoken by Chief Justice John Roberts during Heller. So, aren't machine guns arms? Yes. Yes, Ghost. Yes, they are. I know. All bearable arms. Anyway, alright, so check this out. Now listen to what Mr. Smith says about dangerous and unusual weapons. Keyword being and, not or. SCOTUS is explicitly said and. Check this out. If anyone is into investing, you should absolutely visit my friends at Fundrise. They have real world assets like private real estate, private funds that invest in startups. It's both for accredited and non-accredited investors. Fundrise is truly a pioneer in bringing 1%er assets to the masses like you and I. And the best part is that you can invest as little as $10 or more. What better thing could you ask for small investors? I mean, who can't afford $10 to invest? I've personally been using them for a few years now, 3+, and I haven't got a single complaint. There's going to be a link in the description for anyone interested. You'll get a $25 bonus for using my link. Just keep in mind that I'm not an investment advisor at all, so please do your own research and invest at your own risk.
And the Supreme Court says the whys don't line up. That doesn't help the government prove its case. But it goes beyond that. There was a set of laws that the Supreme Court found somewhat analogous that could be considered. And that was the laws that said, that regulated what would be considered dangerous and unusual arms. The Supreme Court said there was a tradition at the time of the founding of banning or regulating dangerous and unusual arms. But then the Supreme Court moved on and extended that out and says, as a consequence, because handguns in America are ubiquitous, and are the most preferred means of self-defense of Americans, guess what? They can't be banned because they're in common use by Americans for lawful purposes, and as a consequence, they are not dangerous and unusual. The DC gun ban falls by the wayside, even though the Supreme Court identified a historical set of analogs that justified the banning of dangerous and unusual weapons. But when they applied that principle to the facts of that case, they found that the government, again, could not justify the modern-day gun control law. Now let's turn to Bruen. How did Bruen deal with these historical analogs, with the how and the why? The Bruen court, of course, did something very similar. The big argument that was made by New York to justify their May issue permit regime, which was basically saying, if you want to get a handgun to protect yourself in public, you have to go Mother May I to licensing officials and say, please, 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 I'm a special person. Give me a gun permit to carry guns in public and exercise my right to bear arms, which of course means to carry guns in public. And the Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional. And why did they do that? Because there was no historical tradition of banning the carrying of guns at the time of the founding. So New York proffered a set of laws that says that you could ban concealed carry. Listen carefully to this. You could ban concealed carry at the time of the founding in many states. That was the argument by New York. But if you look carefully at that, in every state where you could ban concealed carry, those exact same states always allowed for open carry of firearms. In other words, if you look at the how the right was burdened in Bruen, those laws that prohibited the concealed carry of arms was a burden on the mode by which you carried the gun, not the actual carrying of gun in public for self-defense. Because in those states where you could be banned from concealed carrying a gun, you could open carry a gun, effectuating your right to bear arms in public for self-defense. And the Supreme Court thus rejected the New York law in that context, because the New York law banned all modes of carry, both open and concealed, and distinguished those laws proffered by New York as not adequate, because the how the law was burdened was different from what the how the New York law did versus the how it was burdened by those laws banning concealment.
What did y'all think? Is Mr. Smith right? I think he is. And I've learned enough about constitutional law not to just think he is, but I know he's right. Now, if we can just get these corrupt judges to start implementing correct law, that would be a really good start to going back to our roots and the Constitution. So, y'all, don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe. please, I would greatly appreciate it. And if y'all enjoyed this, do me a huge solid and demolish that like button. I mean, knock that sucker out for me. I appreciate that. Bigly, bigly. So, this kind of wraps up part one of the two-part series. I'll be coming up with the second part here in a few days, hopefully, once I get done editing. So this just covers Mr. Mark Smith's 2024 Federalist Society Conference speech. Thank y'all so much for watching. I do really appreciate the support that I do have. God bless.